What would you do if your homeland became a foreign land? That was the fate of Ron Pigpen McKernan. He built the Grateful Dead on a foundation of blues and rawness. And then, in a twist of fate, he found his home invaded by psychedelic sounds and colors he couldn't understand. He was the beating heart of the band, the bad boy in a flowery field. But when the band chose a new path, he became an exile on stage. This is the story of the ghostly spirit left behind by the Grateful Dead, one who died not because of the rock and roll lifestyle, but because it was the revolution he abandoned. A tragedy of dislocation. To understand Pigpen, you have to forget the San Francisco of 1967. You have to rewind past the Summer of Love, past the acid-soaked happenings in Golden Gate Park. You have to go back to the early 1960s to a place just south of the city, Palo Alto. This was not yet the heart of Silicon Valley. It was a sleepy university town with a restless bohemian undercurrent. It was a world of Beat Generation survivors, folk music purists, and disaffected suburban kids searching for something, anything more authentic than the manicured lawns and conformist ambitions of post-war America. The spiritual center of this scene was a bookstore called Kepler's, a legendary haven for free thinkers and radicals. It was more than a store. It was a university of the counterculture where you could find forbidden literature, talk politics, and listen to folk and blues records in the adjacent coffee houses. This was the world where kids could dream of a different kind of life, one not dictated by their parents' expectations. In the predominantly white world of highbrow folk revivalists, Ron McKernan was something of an anomaly. He wasn't a tourist in the blues, he was a native. Born on September 8, 1945, he was the son of Phil McKernan, an R&B DJ and one of the first white DJs on a black radio station. It wasn't just a job, it was a statement. In an era of rigid segregation, Phil McKernan crossed cultural boundaries, sharing his passion for raw black music with a wider audience. While his suburban friends listened to Pat Boone, Pigpen's home was filled with the electronic sounds of Jimmy Reed, Howlin' Wolf, and Lightnin' Hopkins. But the connection ran deeper than just the radio. For a significant period, his family lived in a predominantly black neighborhood. He absorbed the music, the slang, the culture not as an academic pursuit, but as the soundtrack to his childhood. He didn't learn the blues from dusty records. He breathed it in from the world around him. This upbringing made him an outcast from the start. In the sterile, conformist environment of his high school, he was a tough kid with a greaser's haircut and a biker's sensibility. He was already cultivating a hard-drinking, tough-talking persona to protect a shy and sensitive core. He fell in with a crowd of misfits and rebels, finding a home not in the classroom, but in the gritty authenticity of the music he loved. He taught himself piano and harmonica, developing a raw, percussive style that was long on feeling and short on technical finesse. He was a purist. For him, music was supposed to be about struggle, sex, and Saturday night release. It was simple, powerful, and true. Around this same Palo Alto scene drifted another musical prodigy, a banjo player with a quick laugh and an insatiable curiosity named Jerry Garcia. Garcia came from a different world. He was a student of American folk traditions, a disciple of bluegrass and old-timey string band music. He was an explorer, a musical intellectual who was fascinated by the intricate structures and histories of songs. When Jerry first met Pigpen at Dana Morgan's music shop, he saw something he didn't possess: raw, unadulterated, gut-bucket authenticity. Pigpen wasn't playing a role. He was the blues. Garcia was the explorer with nimble fingers and a mind hungry for new musical maps. Pigpen was the anchor with a booming voice and a soul planted firmly in the blues. Their partnership was magnetic and ultimately tragic. And it was from the magnetic pull between these two extremes that the band first began to coalesce. The Grateful Dead did not spring into existence fully formed. It began, as most bands do, in living rooms and music shops. Around 1964, Garcia, Pigpen, and a young aspiring songwriter named Bob Weir formed a jug band. They called themselves Mother McCree's Uptown Jug Champions. The music was acoustic, ramshackle, and joyous. It was a throwback to the pre-war era, a loose collection of folk songs, blues standards, and novelty tunes. In this format, Pigpen was the undeniable star. When the band needed to get low down and dirty, they turned to him. His booming voice and wailing harmonica could transform a Palo Alto coffeehouse into a backcountry juke joint. He was the band's charismatic center, the master of ceremonies, the one who could connect with any audience through sheer force of will. But the times, as a fellow folkie was famously singing, were a-changin'. The British invasion, led by the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, had electrified the airwaves. Bob Dylan had plugged in at the Newport Folk Festival, a move that was seen as an act of betrayal by the purists, but as a signpost to the future by musicians like Jerry Garcia. Garcia was getting bored with the acoustic format. He heard the power and possibility in the electric guitar. He wanted to get loud. He recruited a drummer, the fiery Bill Kreutzmann, and a bassist with a background in avant-garde classical music, the eccentric and brilliant Phil Lesh. They called themselves the Warlocks. In this new electric format, Pigpen was the natural frontman. The music was essentially supercharged R&B. They played covers of songs by the Rolling Stones, Chuck Berry, and of course the raw blues masters that Pigpen revered. He was in his element. He played the Vox Continental organ, his stabbing rhythmic chords, providing a greasy counterpoint to Garcia's increasingly fluid guitar lines. He was the lead singer, the shaman in the center, whipping the crowds at local bars and parties into a frenzy. For a brief shining moment, the Warlocks were his band. The music was coming from his world. Then, a new element was introduced, a chemical catalyst that would change everything. Author Ken Kesey, famous for his novel One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, had returned to the Bay Area with a band of anarchic followers who called themselves the Merry Pranksters. Their gospel was LSD. They believed the drug was a tool for liberation, a way to shatter old perceptions and create a new communal consciousness. To spread this gospel, they began hosting parties they called the acid tests. The acid tests were not concerts. They were multimedia happenings. Lights flashed, films were projected onto walls, strange noises echoed through the room, and at the center of it all was a giant tub of LSD-laced Kool-Aid. They needed a house band, a band that was flexible enough and brave enough to provide a live soundtrack for a collective psychedelic experience. They found the Warlocks. The band enthusiastically embraced their new role. For Garcia, Lesh, and Weir, LSD was a revelation. It dissolved the traditional boundaries of their music. They stopped thinking in terms of 3-minute songs and started thinking in terms of boundless, improvised journeys. They weren't just playing music. They were channeling the chaotic, ecstatic, and sometimes terrifying energy of the room. It was during this period that they stumbled upon a new name. Garcia opened a dictionary at random, and his finger landed on the phrase Grateful Dead. The name, with its mix of the macabre and the spiritual, felt perfect for the strange new music they were making. The Grateful Dead were born in this chemical baptism, but there was one member who stood apart. Pigpen refused to take acid. He was a drinker. His reality was altered by whiskey and cheap wine, not by psychedelic chemicals. He was suspicious of LSD, seeing it as head games and weird shit that had nothing to do with the earthy, grounded blues he loved. This decision, made out of personal preference and perhaps a deep-seated fear of losing control, created the fundamental schism that would define the rest of his life. The other members of the band were now bonded by a shared transformative experience. They were developing a non-verbal, almost telepathic form of communication on stage, one that was fueled by their psychedelic explorations. Pigpen was on the outside looking in. He was the one sober man on a ship charting a course for the psychedelic cosmos. For the first few years, this musical schism was manageable. As the Grateful Dead delved deeper into the extended psychedelic improvisations that were the domain of Garcia and Lesh, Pigpen remained firmly planted in his R&B and blues roots. But this difference was, in fact, a strength. On stage, Pigpen was still an unstoppable powerhouse. From 1966 to around the end of 1968, he was the master of ceremonies, the soul of every show. He was the direct connection to the audience, the raw, primal energy that balanced Garcia's more introverted and cerebral playing. He was the one who could tame the rowdiest elements of their audience, particularly the Hells Angels. They saw in Pigpen a kindred spirit, a hard-drinking, no-bullshit man who just happened to be in a band of long-haired acid heads. He spoke their language, drank their kind of liquor, and shared a disdain for pretense. This made him an unofficial diplomat between the world of the hippies and the outlaw bikers. His performances of blues standards like Good Morning, Little Schoolgirl, and King Bee were pure theater. The stage was his personal sanctuary. He would stalk it, grab the microphone, and transform into a character, part Southern preacher, part back alley hustler. His voice was a versatile instrument that could growl, plead, or unleash a soulful shout. He was the undeniable heart of the band's live show, yet he was becoming a stranger to its emerging soul. But as the band's musical center of gravity shifted towards improvisation and psychedelia, his own footing became less certain. The songwriting partnership between Garcia and lyricist Robert Hunter was blossoming, producing songs that were complex, poetic, and steeped in a kind of mythic Americana that was miles away from the simple 12-bar blues. Weir, too, was developing his own quirky, rhythmically complex songwriting style with his lyricist partner, John Perry Barlow. Albums like 1968's Anthem of the Sun and 1969's Aoxomoxoa were dense, studio-crafted psychedelic masterpieces. They were brilliant, but they had very little room for a blues shouter. Pigpen, who was not a songwriter in the same vein, found himself with less and less to do. His organ playing, while effective in a blues context, was limited compared to the harmonic explorations the rest of the band was undertaking. For a time, the band even brought in a second keyboardist, Tom Constantin, a classically trained musician whose avant-garde sensibilities pushed Pigpen even further to the margins. His salvation, his kingdom on stage, became his signature song, a cover of the Bobby Blue Bland R&B hit, Turn On Your Love Light. Love Light was not just a song, it was a 30-minute improvised theatrical event. Garcia, Weir, and the others would lock into the simple driving groove, and the stage would belong to Pigpen. He would rap, he would preach, he would plead, he would cajole the audience, he would tell stories, he would issue challenges, he would demand that the crowd find a partner, any partner, and turn on their love light for each other. It was pure, unadulterated performance art. For that half hour, he was not the odd man out. He was the undisputed king, the shaman in complete control of the ritual. Love Light was his greatest triumph, but it was also a poignant symbol of his growing musical isolation. It was his anchor point of grit and soul in a rising tide of psychedelic exploration. The drinking, which had always been part of his tough guy persona, escalated. It's impossible not to connect it to his growing sense of alienation. While the rest of the band was finding creative fulfillment in their new musical direction, Pigpen was being left behind. Alcohol was his comfort, his medication, and the fuel for his onstage persona. But it was also a poison. His friends saw the toll it was taking. He began to look bloated, his health clearly failing. Around this time, he formed a deep, if brief, friendship with another hard-drinking blues singer, Janis Joplin. They were kindred spirits in many ways, two white kids from suburban backgrounds who felt the blues with a raw, almost painful authenticity. They were both electrifying performers who were shy and insecure off stage, and they both used alcohol as a shield against the pressures of fame and the sharp edges of their own insecurities. They would hang out, get drunk, and commiserate. Janis's death from a heroin overdose in 1970 was a devastating blow to Pigpen. It was a stark reminder of the dangerous path he himself was on. The year 1970 marked a seismic shift in the Grateful Dead's musical landscape, a deliberate turn away from the chaotic, high-volume psychedelic explorations that had defined their late 60s sound. In a stunningly productive burst of creativity, the band released 2 albums that would define their legacy and cement their status as Americana pioneers, Working Man's Dead and American Beauty. These records represented a conscious pivot towards subtlety and songcraft, heavily influenced by the acoustic textures of the band and the intricate vocal work of Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young. The result was a collection of beautifully crafted songs, rich with pastoral imagery, nuanced storytelling, and layered 3-part vocal harmonies that became a new hallmark of their sound. These albums were, by any measure, masterpieces. They contained the very songs, Uncle John's Band, Ripple, Box of Rain, Friend of the Devil, that would become canonical, etching the Garcia/Hunter and Weir/Barlow songwriting partnerships into the pantheon of great American music. Yet, they were masterpieces in which the band's original frontman, Ron Pigpen McKernan, was almost invisible. The new sound, built on delicate acoustic interplay and precise vocal arrangements, had no organic place for his raw, guttural blues shouting style. His contributions were relegated to the margins, adding color rather than providing the core structure. He played a tasteful harmonica on the country blues number Operator, his only lead vocal across the 2 LPs, and added subtle organ fills elsewhere. But his presence was textural, not foundational. His voice, once the central pillar of the band's sound, the undeniable force that could command any audience and anchor their wildest jams, was largely absent. For the man who had been the charismatic, undisputed center of the band just 2 years prior, this period marked a profound and difficult transition. He was now a sideman in a band that had once been his, a bluesman adrift in a new ocean of folk and country rock. This artistic distance would soon be tragically compounded by a physical one, as the lifestyle that had defined his identity began to catch up with him in the most brutal way imaginable. The near-fatal internal hemorrhage that forced Ron Pigpen McKernan off the road in 1971 was, by all accounts, supposed to be the end. Doctors gave him a stark ultimatum: stop drinking or die. For a man whose entire public persona was built on a foundation of whiskey-fueled bravado and blues-shouting swagger, it was a devastating blow. The Grateful Dead, the musical family he had co-founded, continued on without him, with keyboardist Keith Godchaux ably filling his instrumental role. For months, Pigpen was a ghost, a man confronting his own mortality in quiet isolation. But from this crucible of forced sobriety and reflection, an unexpected and profound creative spark emerged. For the first time in his career, Pigpen began to contribute his own original songs to the band's repertoire. Before he had been the master interpreter, the authentic vessel for the songs of Howlin' Wolf and Lightnin' Hopkins, now he became a creator. These new pieces weren't just blues covers, they were intricate reflections of his own life, personality, and newfound vulnerability. There was the jaunty, swaggering Mr. Charlie, a tight, funky R&B number co-written with Robert Hunter. This collaboration was itself a significant bridge, a rare instance of the band's primary lyricist pairing with its raw, bluesy heart, creating a classic slice of Americana noir that felt both timeless and fresh. He offered up tunes like Empty Pages and Chinatown Shuffle, which showcased his often overlooked rootsy barrelhouse piano style, reminding everyone that his musicianship extended far beyond the harmonica and microphone. But the most revealing and poignant of all was the hauntingly autobiographical ballad The Stranger, Two Souls in Communion. This was a song unlike any he had ever performed. A slow-burning, melancholic blues, it stripped away all the macho posturing of his past performances. In its place was the raw, trembling voice of a man reckoning with his own loneliness. He sang with a vulnerability that was almost shocking, a heartbreaking confession from someone who felt increasingly like an outsider in the psychedelic circus he had helped create. I'm a stranger in your town. You're a stranger in my town, too. What's a man but a stranger? The title itself hinted at a profound isolation. The two souls in communion seemed to be no one but himself, and the loneliness that had become his constant companion. For a brief, hopeful moment, it seemed like he might be able to carve out this new, more introspective role for himself. The band was planning an ambitious grand tour of Europe in the spring of 1972, their first, and Pigpen, armed with his new material, was determined to be a part of it. The Europe 72 tour was Pigpen's final stand. It became his personal Iliad, a heroic and tragic final act played out on the grand stages of the old world. It was a last incredible display of his creative power and sheer force of will. The recordings from that legendary tour capture the stark duality of his condition. His body was clearly failing, but his spirit was incandescent. He was a ghostly figure, gaunt and frail, often seen sitting quietly behind his organ, conserving every ounce of energy. But when the spotlight found him, a miraculous transformation would occur. He would rise, step to the microphone, and pour every last drop of his life force into his performances. The voice, though perhaps lacking some of its former booming power, was imbued with a new gravitas, the sound of a man who had stared into the abyss and was now singing with all he had left. The band, his brothers, sensed the gravity of the situation and rallied around him. They gave him space and unwavering support, showcasing his new songs prominently in the set lists. On stage, they formed a protective musical cocoon, with Jerry Garcia's guitar weaving soulful, supportive lines around his vocals, and the rhythm section locking into his grooves with ferocious tenderness. They were lifting him up, ensuring his final contributions were given the grand, powerful treatment they deserved. But the physical toll was immense. The monumental effort of belting out Mr. Charlie, or pouring his soul into the stranger, would leave him visibly drained, drenched in sweat and gasping for breath. He was often too tired to do more than one or two songs a set before he had to retreat to the relative safety of his organ bench. On June 17, 1972, at the Hollywood Bowl in Los Angeles, following the band's triumphant return from Europe, Ron Pigpen McKernan played his final show with the Grateful Dead. There was no fanfare, no grand announcement. The crowd cheering for a band at its absolute peak had no idea they were witnessing the end of an era. He was simply too ill to continue. He quietly retired from the road, stepping away from the only life he had ever known, holding on to the faint hope that he might one day regain his health and return. The historical debate around Pigpen's final years often frames the story in simple terms. Was he pushed out of the band, or did he simply fail to keep up? The truth is far more complex and far more tragic. He wasn't pushed out. The other members, particularly Garcia, loved him dearly and always considered him the true soul of the band. In interviews, Garcia would consistently refer to Pigpen as the most authentic musician he had ever known, the real deal. But they also couldn't stop their own musical evolution for his sake. The Grateful Dead operated like a force of nature, a collective improvisation that was always moving forward, always exploring new territory. Pigpen was the anchor to the blues, but the ship was now sailing into psychedelic waters that he couldn't or wouldn't navigate. His tragedy was not one of malice, but of organic, inevitable artistic divergence. His refusal to change was a testament to his authenticity, but it also sealed his fate within a band whose only constant was change. His final months were spent in quiet seclusion. He reconnected with his family and tried to take care of himself, but the damage to his body was too severe. On March 8, 1973, his landlady found him dead in his apartment in Corte Madera, California. The cause of death was a gastrointestinal hemorrhage caused by his liver disease. He was 27 years old. The man who had lived his life on stage at the center of a storm of sound and energy died alone. The death of Ron Pigpen McKernan closed the first chapter of the Grateful Dead, severing the band's final tie to its R&B and blues roots. The band would go on to achieve staggering success, but it forever lost the grit and raw bluesy soul that he provided. His legacy is foundational. He was the raw counterweight, the visceral pulse that kept the band's psychedelic adventures from drifting away unmoored. He gave their weirdness weight. However, Pigpen's role is often overshadowed. Unlike other members of the 27 Club, his band not only survived but became a massive phenomenon, inadvertently obscuring its own origin story. Many later generations of fans had little idea that the band began as a hard-charging blues outfit fronted by him. The ultimate tragedy of Pigpen is not just that he died young, but that his creative spirit was being abandoned long before. He was a pure bluesman in a band that was shifting to a new psychedelic language he could not integrate with. His uncompromising authenticity, his greatest strength, was also what made his survival within the ever-changing band impossible.